Hello and welcome to Colonial Outcast, the anti-war and anti-imperialist podcast that both your uncle and presidential hopeful Kamala Harris would absolutely hate because they're both on the interventionist political right. They just are, and I can and will prove it, at least about the Harris part. Not sure about your uncle. So today we're going to be discussing the theoretical escalation ladder in the Middle East. Will the region erupt in an insane and completely avoidable war? For the moment, I'd say no. We're kind of seeing some de-escalation between Iran, Israel, also Hezbollah, Israel. So Israel has a problem on their northern border, as you know, called Hezbollah, which it cannot defeat, but it has to do something. And what is easier than fighting Hezbollah? Well, I'd say invading West Bank and a multi-brigade action to, quote, root out criminals and grab more land. But first, will Kamala Harris, stop this madness and enforce both international law and our own Leahey Laws, which dictate that we can't send arms to a country committing human rights violations? Well, she did her first interview on CNN with VP candidate Walz last night, and here is what she had to say on the matter.
Unsuccessfully to end the war between Israel and Hamas in Gaza. He's been doing it for months and months, along with you. Would you do anything differently? For example, would you withhold some U.S. weapons shipments to Israel? That's what a lot of people on the progressive left want you to do.
Let me be very clear. I'm unequivocal and unwavering in my commitment to Israel's defense and its ability to defend itself. And that's not going to change. But let's take a step back. October 7, 1,200 people were massacred. Many young people who were simply attending a music festival. Women were horribly raped. As I said then, I say today, Israel has a right to defend itself. We would. And how it does so matters. Far too many.
Okay, well, that answers that question. It's kind of crazy that you're a progressive leftist if you're simply asking that we enforce our own laws. But today is a military-oriented episode. I'm Greg Stoker, a former U.S. Army Ranger. We've got Mark Wayne here and Matthew Enderline, friend of the show, a former U.S. Army infantry officer. Well, how's it going, man? You're in Beirut right now.
Pretty good. I've had a location change now in Beirut.
Yeah, and just watching U.S. politics and the insane, Leni Riefenstahl mass spectacle, triumph of the will, Nazi shit that was the DNC. So many flags.
You're giving Kamala Harris a lot of credit there, because in that video, I mean, there was no coherent point whatsoever, and it's pretty obvious that she really has no opinion inside, in her psyche that goes beyond serving her own self-interest and the status quo. So
yeah, I think she's completely abandoned any sort of moral conviction in the name of ambition. So
absolutely, yeah.
The fact that the discourse around what's happening right now is on that reductive and insane a level, where we have the Lancet, one of the most prestigious and peer-reviewed medical journals, saying, it could be up to 180,000 because based off crude death rates from comparable conflicts with the amount of ordnance being dropped and with the population density. But yeah, 1,200 people, some of which were killed by the IDF, we now know. Yeah, but that's kind of where we are. So we wanted to do this episode because you're in close proximity to what's happening. And also, we have powers of analysis from a military perspective of what's going on. We have the Operation Summer Camps. And you thought, when I first brought up this episode idea, that was a fake operation name.
I thought you made that name up to make fun of it, to make it sound ridiculous. But I mean, it's pretty aptly named. We don't even need to change the name to make fun of it.
Right, because if you guys aren't tracking, the assault on the Jenin refugee camp and camps in Tulkarem and Tubas in northern West Bank. That military operation conducted by the IDF has been called Operation Summer Camps. They're either going to assault a bunch of camps in the summer, which they're already doing, or they're going to construct camps for people to occupy during the summer. Okay, so we're going to get into the whole thing. So this operation kicked off about 72 hours ago, and it was a multi-brigade mobilization. We're hearing numbers around like 6,000 boots on the ground, which is a pretty significant mobilization, especially for what's going on militarily in Israel right now. That's a lot of resources, which they are kind of strapped on. But to give context, here's a recent Al Jazeera update from a few hours ago.
Israel has been carrying out what's said to be its biggest military assault for decades here in the occupied West Bank. Bulldozers have been ripping up roads. Troops have gone in with vehicles and on foot. And there have been airstrikes too. Meanwhile, Palestinian armed groups have been fighting back. This was said to be an explosion targeting army vehicles in Tulkarem. Now, Israeli raids have been happening on a daily basis in the occupied West Bank in recent months. But this one is on a different scale. The cities of Jenin, Tulkarem, and Tubas have been raided by Israeli forces. They're home to some of the armed groups and fighters that Israel calls terrorists. It has accused them of planning attacks. To many Palestinians, these groups are resistance fighters against a decades-long occupation recognized as illegal under international law. The military said that these armed groups are getting better at making explosive devices to target them during raids. And there has been coverage in the Israeli media about armed groups making life difficult for Israeli settlers who, don't forget, are residing illegally in the occupied West Bank, according to international law. As part of this latest assault, Israeli forces announced their intention to raid at least one hospital in Jenin. Israel's foreign minister suggested residents would be ordered to leave parts of the northern occupied West Bank. There have been instances where Palestinians were pushed out during another major Israeli assault in July 2023. And evacuation orders have been a major feature of the war in Gaza, where Israel is accused of a genocide against Palestinians. Israel's foreign minister has also said that the army should deal with threats from the occupied West Bank like it has in Gaza. And that is making people here feel worried about what could happen next.
Yeah, so we're going to expand on a lot of this information here in a second. I just wanted to point out that when this operation popped off, like 3 people I was talking to in West Bank deleted their Telegram accounts. So we're kind of going off open source reporting and third-party stuff, like Palestinian Americans who I'm in touch with who have family in West Bank. So first of all, the Israeli army claims that it's the largest operation since Operation Defensive Shield in 2002, which was in response to the Second Intifada. And the Israeli army announced on Wednesday at dawn that it was launching Operation freaking Summer Camps. Jeez, we were both in Afghanistan. We've heard some pretty stupid operation names, but this one takes the cake. I will not. We had one called Operation Foggy Sapphire. That was pretty dumb, but at least you had no idea what we were actually doing or what our actual intent was based off that name. So they're assaulting the north. The operation is targeting, again, armed resistance groups that have spread throughout the Northwest Bank over the past 3 years. You have the Jenin Brigade, the Tulkarem Brigade, the Tubas Brigade, and I'm not sure about what their force disposition is or their equipment. I have seen that they actually don't use primarily AK-47s. I've seen a lot of videos with them with like American or Israeli-made AR-15s, obviously because they get smuggled from Israel proper into West Bank. And a lot of the fighting's intensified since October 7th. So the operation began with the use of reconnaissance planes, helicopters, armed vehicles, and then came the bulldozers. The bulldozers are a massive part of this ground offensive because they're literally just bulldozing everything. And we'll get into some images. It's pretty stunning. They're trying to Gazify northern West Bank right now.
Yeah, I would argue that the bulldozers are the main effort in this operation.
Yeah, you think so?
And I think so, and I think it's important to note that although this is big news, and this is the largest such incursion and invasion in a long time in the West Bank, that there's not a single thing that the Israelis are doing in the West Bank right now that they haven't done yesterday and last week and since October 7th and for decades. The only difference now is the intensity and the time frame in which they're doing it and the amount of forces they're doing it. So I would argue that the bulldozers are the main effort because really you have two sides of this operation, in my opinion. You have the direct military action, against resistance factions in the West Bank, but then you also have this operation being used as a kind of a ruse and an excuse and license to exact terror and intimidation and to destroy the infrastructure and endanger the lives of the Palestinians living in the West Bank. And you'll see that with the destruction of these roads in around Jenin. They've besieged hospitals. Snipers are all around residential areas throughout Jenin and the other areas that these operations are happening in the West Bank, shooting anyone who dares go on the street. And yeah, it's just a continuation of business as usual. It's just intensified, in my opinion, because they can, because they have, the Israelis are emboldened because they have not been held accountable in any meaningful way by the international community for their actions and their genocidal campaign in Gaza. So this is just the next step in their overall, plan to neutralize the Palestinian resistance by directly attacking and demoralizing and hurting the population.
Same old Daya doctrine,
Yep.
sorry, which is, we've mentioned this before, the targeting of civilian sites, civilians, and civilian infrastructure in order to pressure the associated military or militant groups attached to that population group to lay down arms, give up concessions. They don't want to fight the militants, the resistance fighters directly. It serves their purposes more to destroy infrastructure and stuff. So the Israeli Minister of Foreign Affairs, Israel Katz, said on X a couple days ago that the operation must deal with the armed groups, quote, just as we deal with the terrorist infrastructure in Gaza, which is actually just civilian infrastructure, including the temporary evacuation of Palestinian residents, adding that the Israeli assault is a war in every sense. So we're going to get towards the end of this episode, talk about this idea of temporary evacuation, which we all know is not going to be temporary at all. So I think what we should start with is like the hospitals. So during this incursion, the Israeli army has imposed a siege on hospitals, blocking access to the Ibn Sina hospital in Jenin with dirt barricades and surrounding the Jenin governmental hospital. The army has also hindered the work of ambulances by stopping and searching them at every time they tried to enter or leave any of the city's hospitals. The Wi-Fi is cut in the hospitals. There's like no service, so we can't see what's actually going on in there. And according to Israel's Channel 14, the Israeli army intends to search Palestinian patients entering the besieged hospitals. And this coming from Mondo Vice, reporting on the ground, has observed this practice in front of Jenin governmental hospital. So,
AKA you die in an ambulance before they allow you in the hospital.
Yeah.
That's it. I read reports that they were sending ambulances from Tulkarem to Jenin to evacuate people because the ambulances and the services in the hospitals in Jenin can't reach wounded people. So again, it's the military application of these tactics is next to nothing, and I think that's really important for us to pull out. It's put out that there's no military benefit really to besieging a hospital, other than trying to find wounded resistance fighters who are seeking treatment because your intelligence capabilities aren't good enough to find them and track them down, in the field.
Yeah, and we've talked about like targeting hospitals at length. I remember. Were you in Afghanistan in 2015 during the Kunduz incident where Obama hit that
Yeah.
Doctors Without Borders hospital, and that was a huge deal. But now I read this, and it's like completely normalized now. It's just like,
No,
okay,
it's like it's nothing. And no, I was there right before that, actually, in 2014. But I do remember that I was in the captain's career course when that happened, and that was a big incident to talk about. Ruined U.S. relations with MSF forever, I think. But you mentioned the Ibn Sina Hospital in Jenin, and that was just the location a few months ago, if you remember, that those 3 resistance fighters were executed by paramilitary police forces dressed in civilian clothing in their hospital beds.
I mean, that was just in retrospect, it's so hard to keep up with all the absurdities. That entire operation was absurd. First of all, they came in so sloppily. They were like wearing like hijabs with rifles and stuff, just like totally up their own ass. Like we're freaking operators. Fuck, dude. Hell yeah. And then they just murdered 3 people. Also, there's not a lot of application for that in terms of intelligence value. You'd much rather stabilize them that, and conduct like interrogations and stuff, but
of course
that's not what they want to do. So in Tulkarem, the occupation forces also continue their assault on Nur Sham's refugee camp east of the city, notifying residents to evacuate within 4 hours. This is nothing new. Army bulldozers have accompanied dozens of armored vehicles, destroying the main water line supplying the camp and causing extensive destruction to civilian infrastructure. Again, no military purpose to destroying people's access to water.
Not even just no military purpose. And you talk about the displacement. It puts you as an offensive military force at a huge disadvantage to displace an entire population in an area where you're trying to conduct an urban operation. So, I mean, these kind of things, when they do things that are completely antithetical to any sort of tactical or military thinking or convention, they just demonstrate that the real intent and the real focus of these campaigns is to intimidate, displace, and destroy the civilian population, because they know they can't destroy a resistance, an organic resistance like this with guns, airplanes, and missiles. It just we know that from our experience. It simply doesn't happen.
Yeah, it doesn't work.
It always reconstitutes itself, and in actuality, the offensive actions, especially the incredibly haphazard ones like this, do nothing but serve to create solidarity and unity and effort among the various resistance factions.
Yeah, and that's a great segue into the second part, is that the Palestinian commander whose nom de guerre was Abu Suja was killed in Tulkarem during a Israeli operation in West Bank. So the IDF announced on Thursday it had killed the commander of the Tulkarem battalion, Mohammed Jaber, aka Abu Suja, along with 4 other battalion members during an exchange of fire at the Nur Shams camp in West Bank. So the IDF propaganda said that this was a mosque. Let me pull up what we have for the attributed video. This doesn't really look like a mosque to me. So just going to throw that out there. I think now that they're going to use it as, more consent to destroy mosques and erase Palestinian identity within other spaces. But what I wanted to bring up is that some of my Palestinian contacts in America have asserted, and the word on the street is that the PA sold this guy out and gave them the location. So whether that's true or not, when we talk about like solidarity against like the PA and against the occupation, a lot of people who are just kind of on the fence about the PA are like, now, from what I'm gathering from like atmospherics, is that they're kind of done with them and they totally see them as a collaborative government.
Yeah, I don't know a single person who is firmly pro-resistance and also pro-PA. I think it's pretty clear that they've done a lot of detriment to the resistance in the past years and continue to this day. I won't pretend to be an expert on their politics, but that's clearly been demonstrated to me. And I also read reports that the PA had either supported with intelligence or attempted to conduct some arrests against resistance fighters themselves in Nablus with their own security forces.
Yeah, no, that's been going on as well for a minute. It's not just now. So just so the audience has an idea of what this assault is looking like, boycott Caterpillar because these bulldozers are out of control. Three. And then we're starting to see some destruction, not on a Gaza level scale, but we're seeing bulldozers actually literally tearing up roads. That's not a building. That is a road. They've busted beneath the concrete and they're digging a ditch so that cars cannot travel over it.
And they're also destroying water and sewer and electrical lines at the same time. It just, we're going to sound redundant here, saying that this has no military application. And in fact, it's against military conventional thinking to destroy roads when you are the predominantly mechanized force riding around in vehicles and tanks and whatnot. It makes no sense to destroy your own freedom of movement while you're conducting an offensive operation. So again, that's just more proof that the real intent and the real, in my opinion, the main effort and the real goal of this is to make life miserable, dangerous, and untenable for Palestinians in the West Bank to just try to continue their campaign of destruction and genocide like they've done in Gaza for months.
So let's talk about this idea of an escalation ladder, which is a theoretical way to conceptualize where different actors stand in terms of, will this become a regional war? Will it not? So on the lowest rung, I think we have Iran. People are like, Iran's backing all of these proxy factions. They're smuggling weapons into West Bank, which is to some extent very likely the border between Palestine and Jordan, between West Bank and Jordan, is very porous with thousands of people coming back and forth every week, some with guns, some are refugees. There's a huge refugee buffer zone along the border of Jordan that's filled with Palestinians, displaced Palestinians. So that's very likely. So they've got these arming resistance, the axis of resistance, and they still haven't responded to the killing of Ismail Haniyeh in Tehran in an IRGC safe house. I thought they were going to respond in a very moderate way, but they still haven't. I think ceasefire talks and behind the scene diplomatic pressure are kind of making them hold off on that. So they said a retaliatory strike is inevitable. I feel like they have to do something eventually. They're still waiting for the right time. But I don't think they intend to escalate the situation at all. It doesn't serve their purposes. And I'd say medium on the escalation rung would be Hezbollah. They're not doing anything. Since October 7th, they've managed it pretty well. They haven't used their most special capabilities. They've used generally older munitions and haven't really used a lot of their fancy Cadillac stuff. And they haven't really hit anything beyond military intelligence surveillance targets in the north. Exactly. And I think that we would have to rate Israel high on the escalation ladder. They've crossed just about every red line that's been put to them. And also they're high on the escalation ladder because they're at their military capacity. Like, would you agree with that? Like,
Meaning that they can't sustain another major, you know, offensive front. Yeah, I think, could they put, you know, bodies and equipment in a place to do that? Yeah, probably. But would an operation like that have the effects that would make it worth it? Not really, especially in terms of invading Lebanon.
Yeah. So speaking of Lebanon, you actually are there right now in Beirut. I mean, it seems like most of the Israeli airstrikes are confined to like what, the Bekaa Valley, places like that.
Yeah, most of the strikes are in the south, and in the Bekaa, yes, also. Few others in random places. Every few weeks, they put some, you know, they strike targets further north in the Bekaa or up some of the cities in southern Lebanon, but most of them are confined to the south. Yeah.
So do you have the sense that this is gonna kind of maintain the status quo? It's not going to escalate, or actually, it seems like it's de-escalating from an outsider's perspective. What's the word on the street, do you think?
Yeah, I don't think anyone knows, you know, beyond what we know. And again, this is for life in Lebanon. This is, although the threat is acute and seems, you know, more drastic than in other times, this is again pretty much a pretty constant threat of back and forth action between Hezbollah and Israel for years. So I think both of their positions are well established, and I don't think it really doesn't really seem like it serves either Hezbollah's interest or Israel's interest to have a major offensive in Lebanon. But could that happen? You can't rule it out. And certainly the tension is high.
Mm-hmm. So I think for now, even though this operation into West Bank is completely transparent, I don't think that it's really going to change what's happening on the ground. I think, you know, their intentions are becoming inescapably clear, because it's not just that. Also, recently, this is according to the Cradle from August 29th, in Gaza, the Israeli army is setting up a new position to control Gaza for years to come. The position will be assumed by Israeli officer Elad Goren and will deal with day-to-day civilian and security matters in Gaza. So now they're institutionalizing military occupational positions in a sort of like shadow government. So the Israeli army is planning to establish this position. And this is according to Ynet News, reported on August 29th. The decision comes, quote, in the absence of clear strategic goals for the future of the Gaza Strip. This is coming from Ynet News, which is generally a right-leaning publication, or at least center-right. And so there are no strategic goals. They haven't achieved any of their goals. So now they're just going to have to, stay there? So they began yesterday through this appointment to accept the fact that its responsibility for the Strip will continue for years and will expand, and about 2 million Palestinians will remain under its responsibility. So according to Ynet, the officer will be called the coordinator of government activities in the territories. So the COGAT, if you want to do jargon, and he will
Beautiful
take
acronym.
Yeah. Hey man, you the COGAT for this area? So the report apparently explains that Goren will deal with daily logistical issues such as humanitarian aid deliveries, i.e. making it as hard as possible to get them in there.
My guess is he won't spend a huge portion of his time focusing on the humanitarian aid deliveries. I think
also repairing destroyed infrastructure and contacting international aid organizations. He will also lead long-term civilian evacuation. Here's what we go talking about. He will also lead long-term civilian evacuation in order to, quote, maintain international legitimacy to continue fighting in Gaza without, quote, witnessing a humanitarian crisis or famine. Well, too late, motherfucker. Like, what? I think at this point, it's almost so exhausting because it's so blazingly apparent what they're doing. This idea that they will um, lead long-term civilian evacuation in order to maintain international legitimacy. Is there a way to legitimize ethnic cleansing? Because what we have to talk about Jordan in this too, you know,
Yeah.
like a
You could
lot
ask
of,
the White House that question.
yeah. I don't know. Like I came into this episode with a certain idea about like what I wanted to talk about and what I wanted to get into, but now I'm just looking at it. I was like, dude, it's
I mean,
just exhausting. Yeah.
it is. Yeah, naturally. I mean, let's just take that list of words that sounded like it was written by Chat GPT and
Uh-huh.
kind of throw that out the window. And let's call this occupation what it is and what the real goal is. And we've known that it's been pretty obvious from the beginning, since October, is that their long-term goal is to reoccupy on the ground and to control the territory in Gaza in the long term. Because if we want to tie that back to what's happening in the West Bank, talking about earlier what the equipment, the weapons, the capabilities are in the West Bank, which doesn't reach the training and the operational capability and the weapons they have in Gaza. And why is that? It's because for the past several decades, the West Bank has been under constant military occupation, and it's much harder to build a meaningful resistance movement and equip it when the occupation forces are on the ground. In Gaza, they had for a long time relative, freedom of movement to find their own way to operate, equip, and train, and that's why their resistance is stronger there. So the Israelis know that, and so they want to do the same thing that they've done for decades in the West Bank, occupy it. So once the high intensity part of the conflict is over, then it's much more difficult for the resistance to reconstitute themselves. And they're doing that by clearing and controlling this Netzarim corridor, which will kind of cut the Gaza Strip in two and sever Gaza City in the north from the rest of the Strip to the south, and by controlling the Philadelphia corridor, which is the border between Rafah City in Gaza and Rafah City in Egypt, in Sinai. And that, for one, is against a U.S.-backed, signed, and enforced to this day international, peace treaty to stop the 73 war and to that took Sinai back and gave it to Egypt, and there's an organization called the Multinational Force and Observers, which has a constant, continuous mission since 1980 in the Sinai Peninsula to enforce the terms of this agreement. One of which is you can't roll tanks. The Israelis cannot roll tanks anywhere within a kilometer or 2 kilometers or whatever it is of the Philadelphia corridor and the border. And when they did this, there was no action from the MFO, which is supported, funded, and backed, and almost entirely by the U.S. And nothing from Egypt. It just happened, and now they want to walk back the terms of that peace treaty, which has kept relative stability between Egypt and Israel since the 70s, and change the rules. And they're doing that because they don't want the porous border, and they don't want the resistance in Gaza to be able to move men, weapons, and equipment through the border and through tunnels and through that region. So.
Yeah, and they're actually going to try and ghettoize different sections of the Gaza Strip. So you have the Netzarim corridor, which you mentioned, which bisects the Gaza Strip along the Wadi Gaza and terminates in that U.S. aid port, that failed humanitarian project. And right now, according to satellite imagery reviewed by Ynet News, which is also a Hebrew media outlet, earlier this week, Israeli forces have expanded the Netzarim corridor in the Gaza Strip to include 4 large outposts designed to permanently house troops. Okay, so now we have like hard site barracks is being constructed awesome. And then forensic architecture, a research group based at Goldsmiths University, also revealed via satellite imagery on August 20th that the Israeli army is building a new land corridor east of Gaza City, which means it will be there'll be three or like let me see, like three different sections right now of Gaza with corridors, military corridors that have like perimeters and I assume basic rudimentary like earthworks and like barbed wire fence and basically checkpoints to hinder movement of people between each of these three sections of the Gaza Strip.
Yeah, and what they've also done as part of that is they've cleared, in the case of the Netzarim corridor, they've cleared almost a kilometer wide, I think, swath of land to support this and to give themselves some sort of buffer from the civilian population. And what was there before that? What was this area was a very large and very important agricultural area in the Gaza Strip. So they've destroyed thousands of acres of farmland and ancient orchards to do this. They've just cleared it, and you can see that in the satellite imagery.
Yeah. So I think, and that's just destroying the arable land will just require the Palestinians left in Gaza to rely even more on international aid, which they control, reinforcing controlled starvation. And how do you see all of this ending potentially? Like at this point, like, I mean, look, I made the naive decision like a few months ago to be like, I think they'll do a ceasefire before Ramadan because it just makes a lot of sense. That was back when I thought like we were trying to at least have the pretense of upholding international law, not losing all of our soft power to China and Russia and now Iran. And, we wanted to not risk a wider regional confrontation, especially in light of the pressures put on the U.S. war machine by the war in Ukraine and a geostrategic shift to East Asia over Taiwan and Japan. But that's just gone out the window. I think, I don't see this ending. Like it's going to be a year in like a month.
Yeah, that's insane. I think we're farther away from a ceasefire
now
than we've ever been. There was a point where it seemed like it was close, and I think that was just kind of ignorance on my part for believing that, in hindsight. But I think Israel is holding out because they're at that point. I don't think they had the political leverage as well as the presence on the ground to really fully and easily and naturally justify their long-term occupation, the details of which we've just discussed. Now it seems like they're closer to that, but then why would there be a ceasefire? Like what benefit to either party would a ceasefire be if Israel is just occupying and in a very drastic and militaristic way? So I don't really see any resolution in the short term, but even in terms of one that's just on paper.
Yeah, no. I don't think this is ending anytime soon. They've just expanded operations in West Bank. They're going to try to make territorial gains. Obviously, the international law doesn't seem to have any teeth because last month the ICJ ruled that it is an occupation, and they are compelled under international law to halt the settlements, destroy the settlements, abandon the settlements, and give the Palestinians their land back. Obviously, that's not going to happen, and it's further away from happening than it's ever been. Our like global Western institutions, these neoliberal institutions, are just kind of like disintegrating in front of our eyes. Europe's a shambles. Like, I think what's happening in Israel, Palestine is kind of like in microcosm the decline of the Western order.
Yeah, I think my bold prediction in the history books is that several years or several decades from now that this this is the moment that the history books determine will be the beginning of the end for U.S. hegemony. It's, I think that's my.
I
That's
think,
my feeling.
yeah, this was definitely the flashpoint. We've been going downhill for a minute.
Sure.
The global war on terror, the 20 years of that insanity really didn't help. But everything seems to be accelerating really fast. And there was a piece in Haaretz by an ex-general that says if Israel continues this war for another year, it'll risk facing total collapse. I think that, yes, we do back them unconditionally with arms. We just heard Kamala Harris say that she wouldn't change the policy, and then she brought up atrocity propaganda about mass sexual violence, which has been debunked completely. But so she won't change her policies, but that doesn't, just because we keep throwing money at Israel and keep throwing bombs at it, it doesn't mean that this is a sustainable project at all.
No, there's no occupation, and there's no colonial project that is sustainable in the long run. That history has taught us that, and you and I have been, kind of on the forefront of that on the ground at certain points. But you could look at any point in history. I mean, there is no settler colonial project that lasts forever. I mean, especially when there is a very justified and indigenous and now quite unified resistance in the face of that. It always outlasts. I don't know how long that'll be, but that's how it goes if you look at the history books.
Yeah, and this is not going to be any different. The cool thing about all empires is all empires fall, and all colonial projects, and there hasn't been a single one that survived. And there were times, and I just kind of want to end on a hopeful note. There were times like people writing in the 70s about how South African apartheid would end, people in the 80s writing about how it would end and talking about how it would end. And it was just kind of unimaginable for a long time. But then it disintegrated rapidly, kind of out of nowhere in ways that nobody really predicted. So I was just talking to the journalist Anthony Lowenstein on my show on Mint Press about this. And I think we just have to keep remembering that the only people who are really fighting for Palestine are going to be these resistance groups, and they're not going to go away. We know that. That's like basic counterinsurgency, lessons learned. You're not going to defeat them. You can degrade their capabilities. Obviously, Hamas's capabilities have been degraded, but they're not going anywhere. In fact, they have an entire new generation of recruits, and we know that Israel can't keep this war going forever. They have massive economic issues. They have massive imaging issues. You have people leaving the colony at unprecedented levels. The thing about apartheid and an occupation is you have to maintain a certain lifestyle and have all these benefits to actually live there and kind of resolve the cognitive dissonance of you living above somebody else. And as that starts to go away, which it has, which a lot of people have left and fled to Cyprus and Europe and back to America under threat of Iranian reprisals. I mean, by the time this ends, because this isn't going to end anytime soon, they would have set up life elsewhere. And would they move back? Well, all we know is that the status quo will never be the same again. No. So whatever they experienced in Israel before, this is doing irreparable damage to the state.
Absolutely. And it's changed, at least it's started to change and has made the public outside of this region aware of the reality of what's going on. And now, in the West, anywhere, there's really no excuse for the cognitive dissonance of just blindly supporting Israel, because the apartheid, the genocide, and the evidence of their crimes is in your face, and you can't ignore that. So I think eventually, I don't know when, and I don't know how, but eventually that goes in favor of a free Palestine.
Yeah, and we just kind of wanted to end that on a hopeful note. We just felt like we had to address this insane operation in West Bank again, without any military sense. Even their tactics, like as Matt brought up, they are primarily a mechanized infantry force, destroying roads that they would need to travel on to successfully maneuver and deploy their troops to different zones and sectors. So yeah, it's completely stupid. Just like they did in Gaza, they are a mechanized force. They don't like getting out of their vehicles, and they turn the Gaza Strip literally into Stalingrad. And tanks can drive over a lot of stuff, but not rubble, because you'll just start throwing tracks.
Nope.
So Jesus effing Christ, it's so dumb. And it's just, this is not how you wage war. And oh my God, I think just guys, we just need to address this operation. We think that they're going to try to displace people from the north, not let them back in. They're going to immediately bring in settlers. You have Ben-Gvir saying a bunch of wild stuff about, Al-Aqsa Mosque and insulting the Hashemite monarchy and goading them. But of course, the Jordanian monarchy is not going to do anything. They're just going to, take it on the face and crack down on anti-Israel speech through the Jordanian Secret Service. They have people in Amman being disappeared for posting pro-Palestine stuff indefinitely. So when I say that the resistance is really the only thing fighting for Palestine, it's kind of true, because Hezbollah has their own responsibilities. They have a reputation for good governance in southern Lebanon, generally speaking.
Sure.
And their first responsibility is the Lebanese people. So they're not going to risk an action that could level Beirut, because Benjamin Netanyahu said explicitly that if Hezbollah opens up a second front, they will Israel will, quote, turn Beirut into Gaza, unquote. Well, first of all, they don't have enough bombs anymore to do that, but they can still do significant damage. And of course, it doesn't serve Iranian interests for them to get directly involved either. So you have a collaborative government in Jordan to the east, and then you have one to the west in Egypt, because Sisi has
absolutely
tripled exports to Israel since the beginning of the war. And so, yeah, the resistance is the only thing going for it. And this invasion of West Bank, I think, will turn out to be a massive strategic blunder. We already know, it's a really expensive and complicated mobilization. A lot of troops are being involved. A lot of troops are already exhausted. A lot of these reservists who thought that they would never ever have to go and actually fight. They just did their 2 years, like a decade ago, and now they thought they were going to work a nice coding job in Tel Aviv and have a nice life, are being asked to continually redeploy from Gaza to the north to the West Bank. And troop morale is going to take a hit. We've already been seeing mental health issues going on. And this is not something that they can fight their way out of, but Netanyahu is going to keep this going, and the far right is going to keep this going for their own political survival. So it'll end in implosion, as we said. That's what I think. But when is that going to happen? I don't know. Historical precedents, kind of tough right now because we're in an uncharted territory. So we'll just wait and see. We just wanted to address the stuff going on in West Bank. Anything else, Matt?
No, just school starting. So I think it's important, in light of all this, to continue the action in the U.S. and throughout the West, student protests. You mentioned South Africa. One of the huge things that tipped the international scales against them was the BDS movement. So continuing boycotts and protests. And mentioning the resistance, it's important to note that our activism should include solidarity for the resistance. That's something that's slowly been adopted in circles in the West, but it's important because this is the only hope that the Palestinians have for change, because the international community has largely abandoned them.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's been no different from any other anti-colonial movement. The Western community condemns them as savages and terrorists, and it always ends up working out eventually. So We'll keep looking at this, but it's just going to be more of the same. I believe so. Thank you guys so much for listening. That's what's going on in West Bank and the larger theater of operations. Thank you so much for listening, and we will see you next week. All right. Thanks again, Matt, for coming on. And
Thanks for having me, Greg.
have a good night.